the children all came in. Some of them were little tiny ones, and others were taller. When I began teaching, some of my pupils were taller than what I was, weighed more too. The seats were not exactly like this. Most of the seats were like this longer one. When I started the school myself I first sat in a long bench. It would be about 6 feet long, and it was painted red. The seat was pretty high. My feet didn't touch the floor. The top of the desk was slanted down like this. It wasn't quite so wide. It too was painted red, and the desk you just put was like a shelf under the top here. The first thing you would do would be get the children's names and get as much of a record of them as you could. They sometimes brought their report cards, and you would see, and then there was a permanent record that you would look through and see what their classes were and what kind of work that they did, if they were pretty good. Then when the little ones, of course, they would need to learn their letters. When I was teaching, I always liked to teach them the sounds of the letters, so I used the phonic method, and they really did very, very well that way, I thought. I know I've had little ones that, as one little boy, I told him, you try reading everything you can lay your hands on, the funny paper or anything, and he really came ahead fast. But he would sound out every word, each letter, and then when he got his word, he would go right ahead. The little ones, you had to prepare work for them, see to it that they had something, you could give them something to draw, or you could give them little blocks to count and play with. Of course, they were supposed to keep very, very quiet, so that the older ones were not disturbed, because you had to teach the older ones and let the little ones try to employ themselves as well as possible. I used to, sometimes I had got a set of books, and if they were very, very good, I'd say, well, now you can look through my books. And they would be very, very careful. Their hands would be clean, and they would be very, very careful to keep my books nice. In some schools, you would have maybe 10 or 12 pupils. In others, you had more. One of the last schools where I taught, there were 36 pupils there when I went there first, and the next year there were 40, the next year 46, which was quite a problem. Some of those children too had never had any English at all, and so my French improved. Those French children, though, were really very, very nice. And at that time, of course, with so many pupils, and of course I had all the classes from the very beginning right up to the entrance class, well, there was quite a lot of work to be done, and I did manage to get a hectograph, which you made from white glue and glycerin. The hectograph I put in a tin pan, about 8 by 10, and when it was finished, when it was melted and set in the pan, it would look like jelly something, and you used a hectograph pencil or hectograph ink. The hectograph ink was more permanent than the pencil, but they were both good. I used to hectograph things, and the children were fascinated with this hectograph, and they used to love to hectograph for me. They loved to help me. They even used to quarrel with each other in the yard. One would say, "It's my turn to hectograph," and the other would say, "No, it's my turn. You did it before." And so they would quarrel with each other and then come in and do some hectographing for me, which was a great help. The French children were very anxious too to study scripture as well as and they did really very well with it too. I had one pupil, not while I was teaching, but when the teacher that followed me told me about it. He wanted to study scripture, and his mother came and asked the teacher if he could take this subject that he wanted to, and he took the examination with the other children, and he passed and did well. We used to be expected to draw maps. When I was going, we were not allowed to copy a map. But then later on, when I was going to school myself, we used to put the map against the window and trace it. And I found I learned a lot more that way than by drawing the map, by freehand drawing. One year that I went, we were studying the British Empire, and I really learned a lot by tracing maps. Another thing you had to do was keep a record. This is a sample of the report card. The subjects and the marks, and then the parent's signature and the teacher's signature. And this is for each month. When I began teaching, we had to teach 200 days during the year. We got Christmas and New Year's off, and usually the week in between, well, always the week in between. Then there never was any more breaks in the year until Easter, and you got Easter Monday and Good Friday. And then you kept right on until the end of June. Sometimes it would depend on when the end of June was. If it was in the middle of the week, you usually taught right up till the end. And if it were on Monday, say, well, you usually close on Friday. And so then you had your 2 months holidays. When you went to the school first, your first month's salary, they deducted 15% for the first month, so that the first month you didn't get your full salary, whatever it was. The first year I taught, I got $60 a month, and I thought, oh, that was wealth. So in the first month I got $45. The first $15 was kept for the teacher's pension fund, to which the teachers all paid, of course. Later on, when the hard times came, we lost 25% of our salary, so, well, it was harder, of course, to get along. Boarding, you went around, you boarded with a certain family for the year. Usually, I can understand all right, very, very well why it was done, but the teacher usually got the coldest room in the house. The people that lived in the house, of course, kept the warm rooms for themselves. You could understand that, but the teacher really sometimes was pretty chilly. Usually everybody was, the people that you boarded with were very friendly and very accommodating, very kind and good. Well, if they went shopping, you had a chance to go with them, and you had a chance to use their telephone and whatever. Partway through the time that I taught, the board of education decided that we could have, in grade 7, we could go to a high school to try the entrance examination. Some parents didn't really value that very much, but it was a big break for the teacher. The setting of the examinations, well, of course it depended on whether you were pretty hard to please or not. The inspector told me, you're hard to please, it's a good thing. I guess the teachers did, and the children didn't think so. But anyway, I did want the children to have their work perfect if it was possible. The only way we had of heating the schoolrooms was by a box stove. And usually the children would bring in the wood, and we didn't really, most schools where I was, we didn't really have a wood box. We just brought the wood in and put it in the stove as we needed it. The ones that sat beside the stove were too warm most of the time, or a good deal of the time, and the ones that were farthest away were cold. The box stove sometimes was near the door, and so there was a big long string of pipes from the stove way up by the ceiling, and the chimney would be at the other end of the room. And the pipes, of course, would carry what heat there was there. One time, the inspectors, or when we'd have a teachers' convention, they recommended a jacket on the stove. Well, I thought I was doing wonders when we got a jacket on the stove. Well, the cold air was supposed to come in at the bottom, and the hot air out over the stove. So that the ones near the wall were supposed to be getting more of the heat than the ones right close to the stove. Whether that really worked or not, I don't know. We did have a library in the back of the room where the children were allowed to go and pick the books that they wanted to eat or to read. There were certain books, of course, on the course of study that were recommended, and well, I spent hours upon hours upon hours from writing Homer's Odyssey. I used to read a piece and write the story, and read another piece and write the story. I'm sure that the teacher that had to read my composition would be sick and tired of it, but he got it anyway. They didn't all do it that way, and some of the children, that's where the literacy program would really come in. Some of the children didn't know how to read well enough to be able to understand the stories that they were reading, which was a great drawback. We sometimes had an organ in the school, and we were very, very privileged if some of the children could play the hymns that we sang. At that time, we were supposed to open each day's work with reading from the Bible, the Lord's Prayer, and you could have a hymn if you wanted to. I always wanted to, if there was an organ and somebody could play. And I sometimes played myself, but anyway, we did have music, if it was possible. I tried to have a hymn or two whenever we could. We had monthly examinations usually, and sometimes spelling was one of the worst subjects, a very hard subject for some children. I'm very thankful to my mother because she taught me how to sound words out, and I could spell more easily than a good many children did. But it was thanks to the teaching I got from her. Then towards the end of the time that I was teaching, they had what was called your personal spelling list, and some of the words that were listed on this spelling list were ridiculous. Sometimes it would be it and so and little words like that. I never could understand why, but anyway, we used to go over these just about weekly. Arithmetic was a good subject for some. Others it wasn't so good. Arithmetic was my bugbear, but anyway, I managed to get through. when the children were coming to school and going home, the teacher was responsible for the children when they left home and until they got to school. Well, she was responsible for them until they got back home again, on the way coming to school and on the way going back home. So if they misbehaved on the way to school or on the way home, well, that was the teacher's fault. And, well, something had to be done, of course. The water wasn't always available at the school. We didn't have a well. At least I don't think I ever taught at a school where there was a well. So the children had to carry the water from, well, the nearest neighbour usually. So the job of the teacher was to allot two to go for water, and then the sweeping of the floor was generally done by the children too. And so 2 girls were allotted a sweeping day, and 2 boys were allotted a day to go to carry the water. One place where I was, they just brought the wood, and the pupils were supposed to pile it. So anyway, they told me, well, you give them some candy or something, so this was what I tried to do. School went in at 9 o'clock, and well, of course the teacher was supposed to be there at least 15 minutes early. Then there was a break period, sometimes 11:15, sometimes 10:30, sometimes like that, but anyway, you got 15 minutes. And the same thing in the afternoon, there was a break period. You were allowed an hour at noon, and you got a break period then in the afternoon, usually from 2 to 2:30 to 2:15 or something like that. In the winter time, at some schools, the going was pretty rough sometimes with the snow, and the roads were not always plowed. Some children had a long way to walk, and others, well, when I was teaching on Calumet Island, the snowplow hadn't come and I got stuck in the snow. A neighbour very kindly came and helped me out. I just couldn't get any further. But that didn't always happen, of course. But when winter came and the going was difficult, we used to eliminate recess in the morning and in the afternoon and leave half an hour early then, so the school went in at 9 and came out at 3:30, because we did without recess and in the morning and in the afternoon. Grammar was the thing that we I realize now that according to the way teaching is done at the present time, we must have wasted hours upon hours upon hours, because we used to analyze and parse, and we took ever so long doing this. I found it very interesting, but most people hated it. It's really something, although we don't use it at all now, of course. It's something that teaches you how to talk properly. You're using double negatives for one thing, and where to use a double, where the subject is plural, the verb must be plural, and but we did it the hard way. We had to take hours and hours and learn these things separately, which is never done now, of course.
Should be.
What else?
I said it should be.
What?
It should be.
Well, it should, yes, you're very right, it should. Bosses are now complaining about the way children, about the way their employees
Tell
spell.
about the map, point out the
Oh,
map
yes,
of
the map.
Canada.
The maps were very important. We did, some children were very, very fond of maps, and they would sit and study maps and really enjoy it. Sometimes you could have a dissected map and let them put them together. And as I said, when we were allowed to trace the maps, you learned a great deal. I did anyway.
But that's the
At that time too, when I started the school, Manitoba was called the postage stamp province. Now it goes up, of course, to Hudson Bay. And Ontario goes right up to Mount Hudson Bay now too, and it didn't then.
Same with Quebec and Labrador.
Labrador was small.
Labrador, yes. Quebec was the way the outline is now, but at that time it was small. See, it goes around here and here. Now the whole thing. But and Newfoundland is pink, and Labrador was just this little one strip. It was great to study some of the history. Champlain used to be, or Champlain, as they say now, was my hero. I used to really enjoy listening or reading about how he took his trips up and down, these voyageurs, and how they conquered, and yet how they managed to live in the rough, the teepees and the long house and whatever. I found that very interesting. I used to like to read about Champlain. The other explorers, Fraser and the others going out west, of course that was very interesting too. And I can remember when King Edward died. It was in 1910. There was a day's holiday at school. That was before I started to go to school. What else?
What about lunches?
When I was teaching too, I did try, I guess maybe it was the Women's Institute that sort of started this, but I did try to have a hot lunch for the children a good many times at noon. Now when I was teaching at Waltham, the children used to bring potatoes with them, and we'd roast them in the ashes. And my landlord made me a big long table, and we used to sit there, and I'd help them to peel their potatoes, and I remember I'd get them set down on a bench, and I'd say, now then, set sail. They'd begin and eat their hot potatoes. In another place, they got me a big pan, and I'd used to set it on top of the box stove, and we'd heat soup. The Institute too did supply canned soup, which was very nice. Sometimes they would bring beans or something like that. Then there was another little fad that we had. We liked canned tomatoes and soda biscuits, soda crackers. And the children used to like that pretty well. But these, the neighbors used to laugh and say it was my soup kitchen. But they did enjoy their hot lunch. That wasn't in every school, that was only in, well, when the King George and Queen Elizabeth were crowned, I remember I was teaching on Calumet Island, and we planted a tree for each of the princesses. Of course, these trees didn't last very long, but they were planted anyway. We had a soup kitchen there too, a big pan. One of the neighbors, one of the girls' mothers used to make pea soup and put carrots in it. Was it ever good on these cold days? The school was a cold building too. Most of these schools were. They were log buildings. Sometimes they were covered over with clapboards. Other times they were just log buildings. And when you'd go in the morning, in the winter time anyway, it was really cold. I remember when I was teaching at Waltham, the temperature went down to 50 below, and some of the children had a piece to walk, maybe a mile or so. I had about a mile, about maybe 3/4 of a mile, but it was in a sheltered place so that I wasn't cold. And then you dressed for it. You put on heavy clothing. But this morning anyway, the temperature had been 50 below over the weekend, and really it was very cold that day until I wore my coat until noon, which was unusual.
The students would be from all grades.
Right.
The students would cover the full range of from the youngest to the.
One to
Yeah.
grade seven.
The youngest one, when they began to come to school, usually would be 6 or 7. And some of them could read a little bit, some of them knew some of their letters. One boy, well, his parents had given up, they said he was retarded, and he couldn't count. I think he maybe counted till about 10. Well, inside of a month I had him counting to 100. And I gave him a bookmark. Oh, he's treasuring that bookmark yet. And the oldest ones, the older ones, would be, maybe 13 or 14 when they reached grade 7. Depending on a good many things. Some children were not very strong and lost time through sickness, and others, of course, the farm, when I was going to school, there were 2 older boys. Now they must have been maybe 15 or so. They were twins. 2 boys went overseas in the First World War, and one of them was killed, blown to bits. And the other one came home, a terrible wreck. But I remember these boys, they lived on a farm, and during the summer, during the time when they would be putting in the crop, where they would be digging potatoes or cutting the hay and grain, not the hay because that was done in the summertime when the holiday time, but during the seeding time, they would be needed at home to help with the chores. So they might begin when the weather turned really cold, perhaps like the 1st of November, and they might get a chance to go to school until maybe the end of April, or more likely the middle of April, when they would begin doing the spring planting. They would have to stay at home to help with putting in the crop and putting in the garden and whatever. So that they didn't have the same chance of getting ahead that the other ones did that couldn't be at school regularly.